That time I got reincarnated as a demon lord, English, by LordedoMal44. 51-sided massacre P3. A few minutes before. Seal stopped walking after he had gone far enough away. Now, not only would Rimuru not see her fight against the special ogress she had chosen to test, there would also be a low probability that either battle could interfere with the other. Seal was the one who was most aware of the skills Rimuru had acquired, even more than Rimuru himself, and she knew how much her skills could affect the environment around her. Even just geoforce was more than enough to turn a good portion of the forest into a sea of rocks, and could even erase a mountain from the map, of course only if used properly. Still, from the distance they were at, Seal was sure there would be no further interference than expected. With this, we can begin our battle. Speaking these words, Seal stopped where he was and turned to the two behind her. The two ogres descended from the chief of ogres. There weren't many emotions in her voice. She still hadn't specified what kind of emotions she should have in battle situations with someone who wasn't an enemy of Rimuru, like in the current case, but she had a certain determination in her gaze despite not have emotions. Indeed, facing the fierce, impassive robotic eyes that Seal presented, the two ogres, the elder son and the apprentice priestess, could only raise their guard against the being that stood before them. Despite that, the being in front of them remained impassive, as if it didn't care about their existence, or didn't see them as a threat. And, with that kind of attitude, Seal turned towards the eldest son, the ogre with two long horns and red hair, and began to speak. I must confirm in advance. Do you really want to fight me? Yes? No? After all, I don't see you as my opponent and I don't see the need to see you as such. The elder son of the chief of ogres, despite being surprised by the sudden offer, composed himself soon after, getting used to the inhuman behavior that the Majin in front of him had, and replied with a defiant smile. Well, you might think so, but you see, you're picking on my little sister, one of the people dearest to me. How do you expect me to just reveal that you're the one who decided to attack her? I promised my father that I would protect her and I will keep that promise, whatever the cost. The son of the eldest had an iron gaze, proof that despite his inexperience, there was still a determination burning in his chest with more than enough strength that he was motivated to risk his life. Not just his sister, but his pride as the future chief of the ogres, motivated him to fight with all his might. Motivations that Seal saw through, understood, and that made her smile, even though she didn't feel any emotion about it. It just seemed like the right thing to do. If that is so, then I understand. Still, you are not my enemy. Your opponent has already been alerted and is on his way here to deal with you. So I ask that, for now, you just enjoy the show. It took a few seconds for the meaning of those words, that Seal had called someone for backup, to sink into the two ogres' brains, but upon seeing this, both of their eyes fluttered open and they both felt even more wary. Seal was strong, stronger than either of them, and perhaps even the strongest of all ogres, could hope to defeat. Even so, she had asked for help, as if she didn't feel any hint of the pride a strong one should feel. Still, that just made her scarier. Didn't you say you would face us? How can you ask for help? I didn't promise to face either of the two. Besides, their fight was already well prepared, even before the battle started. The chief's son was about to ask what Seal was talking about, but before he did, an ominous feeling crept up his back. Someone, possessing a frightening aura, was approaching him. Someone he recognized at once, but who even he could tell was dozens of times stronger than before. Turning back, in the direction where he felt the aura was coming from, he could clearly see how a red tiger with a mane of black flames was approaching, and how on its back rode a goblin. The most powerful goblin he had seen so far, Gobuta. Don't forget that you are my opponent, Gobuta, despite being in pretty bad shape and seemingly unable to stand on his own, had a fierce look in his eyes, and was clearly ready to attack at any moment. As I imagined, your spells have finally stabilized and you have finished your evolution into a storm goblin. Furthermore, despite being inferior, just like Rigor, you seem to have been able to learn the intrinsic skill known as Ogre's Fury. With that, it's possible for you to push your limits. Seal muttered, partially as if analyzing the situation and partially as if she was just stating the obvious. Of course, to the two, who just stared as Gobuta approached Seal, it wasn't obvious at all. The intrinsic skill, Ogre's Rage, is a well-known skill among ogres, a skill that all warrior ogres train to learn to master. Of course, for younger ogres it was a rarely used skill, fruit of the rage. that was gained by using it, while it was a must, so to speak, for them to become true warriors. That's why knowing that the goblin in front of them had evolved into an ogre-like form enough to acquire this skill was frightening. So that's what happened. To tell you the truth, I just want to avoid the bad ending you warned me about. I don't know this Xian, but I really don't want to have to be the official kitchen tester her. Gobuta turned pale for a moment, as if he was remembering a trauma or a really bad nightmare, and put a hand in front of his mouth as if he had just remembered something really unpleasant. Of course, they didn't know who this Xian was either, but they wouldn't want to taste her food either if it made a warrior like Gobuta scared. Well, both the chief's son and the apprentice priestess could understand the feeling of having eaten the kitchen of someone who was as dangerous as a storm serpent's venom. Don't worry, it won't happen, Seal replied, turning her face away, but she didn't really look serious about it. Gobuta didn't seem to notice that. He just got down from the tiger he was riding and turned towards the boss's son, preparing for combat. Now, recovered after having remembered that nightmare, Gobuta returned to have the appearance of a warrior, even if injured. The chief's son wasn't sure how exactly this battle would go, but looking at Gobuta, he could get an idea that it wouldn't be easy at all. The chief's son looked on as his opponent still struggled to his feet. Even with the ogre's fury acting, he seemed to be unable to keep his body at 100%, proof of how much damage he had taken in his previous battle. Seeing this, the chief's son couldn't help but smile, mentally thanking whoever had fought this goblin before him. And then, enjoying the smile on his face, he put up a strong and confident front, trying to intimidate the injured goblin into returning to the previous fight as soon as possible so that he could help his sister. Ahahaha. Do you really think you can face me wounded like that? I'm an ogre. A goblin is not my opponent, even more so in the deplorable state you are in. Of course, that was just intimidation. He knew that in reality he would have low chances of defeating the goblin in front of him, considering the aura he exuded. There was a difference in experience and strength between both of them and their races, which were in his favor, but he, as one of the ogre chief's sons, had learned a long time ago that there are creatures with skills that simply ignore power and experience. A basilisk, for example, could turn anyone without petrification resistance to stone in mere seconds, even if they are of a slightly stronger race or have a skill level that far surpasses the beast's strength. When considering the power known as skills that exist in this world, a race's strength or someone's technique can still be surpassed. And that was the exact feeling that he, the chief's son, felt coming from this goblin. He felt that the goblin had a skill that could far surpass anything he could do. He still had to try, however, to face this opponent, even if he was stronger than he was. You think I can't? To tell you the truth, I could barely move before, it's just that I really had to face you. Besides, I asked Rimuru-sama to leave you with me, and now it's time to finish you off. Putting his left leg forward a little and placing his sword down with both hands firmly on it, the goblin assumed a fighting stance, even if a little awkward due to the pain. At the same time, the shadow around his feet began to expand, and countless figures, such as different kinds of animals and monsters, began to step out and back into the shadow. Startled, he got into a fighting stance as well, readying his katana to slash at his enemy anytime the goblin moved. There was no doubt that the goblin was dangerous, and he had no idea what kind of skill he might be using. It's time to finish you off, and I saved my strongest mount for just that moment, so let's go with everything, Spike. The moment he shouted those words, a wolf-shaped shadow about 2 meters tall emerged from the ground and enveloped his body. The goblin's height, body shape, and even the sword changed. Now the goblin reached 170 centimeters in height, its arms and legs were thick and covered in leather armor covered in wolf fur and the chest as well. Furthermore, his sword had a different design, with its blade painted in gold, and black lightning crackled around the blade. Lastly, the top of the goblin's head, the last part to emerge from the shadows, had now been covered by a hood in the shape of a wolf, allowing only its eyes to be seen. I hope you managed to follow in my footsteps. The goblin, if he could still be called a goblin, rushed at the chieftain's son and launched an attack with his sword, the speed being such that he had difficulty following his movements with his eyes and managed to block the blow only by luck, as he was used to this kind of abnormal speed after training with the sage. Still, he was surprised, feeling that the goblin in front of him didn't lose much in speed to the sage himself. Don't get distracted. Hearing those words, The chief's son dodged a little out of the way, just in time for the claws of the goblin's other hand to tear into his face. A small gash formed on his forehead, blood spreading across his face and making it difficult for him to see, but he still backed away and returned to his battle stance, never taking his eyes off the goblin. The goblin brought his claws, now stained with blood, close to his nose and sniffed at them for a moment, a smile tugging at his lips in the process. "My name is Gobuta. At the moment, one of the leaders of the mounted troop. I hope I can teach you to never mock Rimuru-sama again." With the goblin, Gobuta assuming a fighting stance again, the chief's son had no option but to prepare himself for the combat to come. He would use everything in his power to defeat this opponent and go help his sister, and no doubt he would succeed in doing so. The apprentice priestess dodged an attack launched by Seal, a sphere of pink energy that hit the ground where she was standing and exploded, and then she counterattacked, launching a ball of blue fire in Ciel's direction. She was already out of breath, not used to maintaining some confrontation for so long while having to dodge enemy attacks, but she couldn't just sit still. When her father announced the attack, going into battle had not been required of her, but seeing how her brother and mother decided to join in, she decided she should go too. Few were the priestesses and apprentices that existed among the ogres, she being the best among all the apprentices, so how could she not go? Despite that, the battle had played out very differently than she had expected it to. Even though their enemies were goblins, an inferior race, the troops they had brought started to fall one after the other. Their opponents had strong mounts, and even though they were barely engaging with the fight, their weaponry wasn't one that could be underestimated either. And then, these Majins emerged, one more powerful than the other. Before her attack could reach Seal, she countered with more of these spheres of pink light, each one destroying her attack before she succeeded. Seal wasted no time and attacked her with more of these attacks, which he had to dodge again. The last time she tried to defend the attack still threw her away and Seal had clearly held back. The last thing she needed was to defend again and end up getting really hurt this time. Barely dodging the attack and letting it explode into some tree far away from her, the apprentice priestess prepared another art as she ran. Facing your enemies separately was not a good option. She didn't stand a chance of fighting Seal alone, and her brother also seemed to be having a hard time on his side. If only both of them could help each other, then perhaps they would have a better chance of defeating their enemies, fighting side by side. With that in mind, she gathered a large amount of magic from the atmosphere and launched her attack towards the ground, preventing Seal from running towards her for a second, and she took the opportunity to run to where her brother was fighting his opponent. A 2-on-2 fight wasn't decided just by the strength of the two parties. The synchrony and teamwork of the partners was important too. Even though he had next to no experience, his brother was still his brother. They were more in sync than most people would be. If they fought together, they would have a chance. While thinking like that, the apprentice priestess finally arrived at the place where her brother and his opponent were fighting. His brother was a little bruised, with blood running down his forehead and staining his arms, with marks of having been attacked by a wild animal. On the other hand, his brother's opponent, who previously looked like a simple goblin, now wore what looked like clothes made of wolf skin, had a different sword, and a frighteningly greater amount of spells than before. She understood that her brother was at a disadvantage with just one look. Before she could say anything or prepare to help her brother, the goblin who was his brother's opponent rushed forward, attacking with his left hand while keeping the claws on his right hand, which were stained with blood, ready to attack. Her brother, on the other hand, also looked prepared to attack, assuming a battle stance that she could immediately recognize. That's it. One of the strongest techniques among battle wills, passed down among ogres which few could master, his brother being one of those few. With that, then he probably thought about killing the goblin, as that must be the only way to win this battle. Of course, she was worried. Her heart was tight seeing the state her brother was in. Still, given the distance she was from him, the only thing she could do was root for her brother's victory. Take this, Oboro. Ryu, fall at once, black lightning. A couple of blows were exchanged. Her brother's sword moved faster than her eyes could follow, and a gash appeared in the goblin's chest, throwing him away faster than his sword could strike his brother. Black smoke billowed around the goblin and suddenly his body separated from that of a 2-meter-tall wolf, before both of them fell to the ground in a faint. And, right after that, a black ray fell from the sky, exactly where his brother was. Engulfed by the lightning, His brother's body was thrown away as well, several burns due to the lightning that hit him. After flying a few meters through the air, his brother's body finally landed, right at his feet. To say he was badly hurt was an understatement. That attack, his brother could have died because of that. If he survived, it was only because the enemy was already exhausted.
Oni-sama, do not worry. Before she could turn to see who had spoken, an impact came from behind her, hitting her in the neck, and then she felt her eyelids grow heavy. The world around her started to go black and she started to lose consciousness while the opponent she had left behind a few seconds before standing behind her. All of you will be close to Rimuru-sama. You will all have your purpose. That was all she heard before she lost consciousness.